Hey, hello, everyone who's here so far. We'll give it one more minute just for people to sign in. Okay, we might as well get started. Welcome, everyone. As you know, this is the final class in this virtual course. Um, so this is Geoeconomics and Conflict is the name of our theme. My name is Eoin McGuirk. I'm an assistant professor at Tufts University. And my co-theme leader is Christoph Trebesch. So my own research is mostly coming from political economy, development economics. Most of my recent research is on sort of conflict and development. And Christoph is very much coming from the geoeconomics world. So this is our attempt to synthesize those two fields and think a little bit about what this intersection looks like, and where we think there's sort of scope for more research, and sort of getting a sense of what the key insights are. So what we'll do is about halfway through, I'll take a look at the Q&A. So if you have any questions or observations that you'd like to share, I'll take a look after about 25 minutes, try to address one or two of them. And then we'll keep going until quarter two, and then we'll spend the last 15 minutes, more or less, maybe the last 15 or 10 minutes addressing the remainder questions in Q&A. And if anyone would like to request the slides, I believe that's something that you will be able to do afterwards. Okay, so those of you who have sat through this course so far will know that the sort of key motivation of this entire initiative is that armed conflict destroys physical capital, it destroys human capital, and it destroys intergroup social capital. And not only that, we know that conflict is costly in other ways too, right? Even the shadow costs of conflict are significant. The risk of conflict alone undermines investment and trade and so on. So because of this, I think we all broadly agree that understanding the causes and consequences of conflict is imperative for economic development, right? And this has become a very, very active field within economics in the last 20 years or so. So the focus for this specific class in the course comes from this sort of shift, right? So most of us who sort of were drawn into the study of the economics and conflict were heavily influenced by research in the early 2000s that called for a shift in focus to civil conflict as opposed to interstate conflict for very good reason, right? So most of the prevalence and fatalities in conflict since the end of the Second World War were due to civil conflict. And so that's where there was sort of a mass shift in focus in that direction. Our entry point in this class and in our recipe theme is on the return of international and what's called internationalized conflict, right? So international conflict being interstate conflict, internationalized conflict is a civil conflict when there's at least one external actor involved, right? So it could be someone who's funded or armed by an external sort of cross-border group. So where are we getting this from? So here I'm showing you conflict fatalities that comes from UCDP geocoded conflict dataset. We have the time series from 1989 to about 2023, and we've separated fatalities into two groups. Okay, so we're only looking at fatalities in two-sided battle events. In the solid line, you can see fatalities that are due to purely domestic conflict, okay, purely internal civil conflict. In the broken line, you can see fatalities due to international conflict, or what we're calling the combination of interstate war plus internationalized domestic conflict. And what you can see is for the first 25 years, so up until about 2015 or so, there are more fatalities in domestic conflict relative to international conflict, right? Consistent with that shift in the 2000s towards civil conflict. But you can see from 2015 onwards, this is very much flipped in a fairly dramatic way, right? So since 2015, on average, there have been far more fatalities due to, broadly speaking, international conflict rather than domestic conflict. Okay, so that's sort of where we're coming in on this. And this reversal is coinciding with a bunch of things that may or may not be driving this, right? So broadly speaking, a change in the international political and economic order, specifically a weakening of US hegemony, the emergence of new powers in Asia, new threats, and certainly the new realization of external wars, such as the Russian war in Ukraine, and plenty of international involvement in internal wars that continue around the world, right? So in Gaza and Sudan, in Syria, Yemen, across the Sahel, we could add in the DRC and many other places, right? So broadly speaking, it's important to understand the interplay between conflict and international power dynamics, rather than solely focusing on domestic political economy, right? So that's sort of our call to arms, so to speak, for this theme. So geoeconomics is a term I didn't even know myself until not that long ago. There are a few definitions out there. We're going to keep it very, very broad. So geoeconomics is the field of study that examines the links between geopolitics and economics. Okay, so in practice, many people understand geoeconomics as being studying um, the use of economic policy for geopolitical objectives or geopolitical ends. Okay, we can even go more broad and just say the economics of international political power rivalry. And that definition just sort of creates the distinction between domestic political economy and political economy that allows for cross-border influences. So the focus for this class and for our pathfinding paper on which this class is based is on the intersection between geoeconomics and conflict. And what this means in practice is that we will be focusing more than the other themes on interstate political conflict and on the external dimension to intrastate political conflict, as I mentioned earlier, these internationalized conflicts. So what does this intersection mean? So what we'll do in this class, we'll spend most of our time sort of looking at the state of the literature in this intersection. The traditional topics, or what we're calling the traditional topics, are going to be the use of geoeconomic tools. Okay, so from Baldwin's famous book in 1985 on economic statecraft. So basically, the use of various economic incentives and sanctions, right? So the use of economic carrots and sticks to coerce or to influence outcomes in different countries. We're going to talk for a bit about the relationship between trade and war, and sort of spread throughout the conversation, we'll make various references to the economics of war more generally. In the second part of today's class, we're going to talk about what we phrase or what we label pathfinding topics. So these are areas where we think the literature is quite thin and there's plenty of scope for more work, right? So one important pathfinding topic we think is broadening the geoeconomic toolkit to reflect what leaders actually do today, right? So if you look at how leaders influence outcomes in third-party countries, they're using far more tools than the strict set of economic incentives and sanctions, right? So they could be using proxy conflict, they could be arming conflict actors in other countries, they could be directly providing military aid, they could be engaging in sabotage and espionage and things like this. We're also going to talk about, very generally speaking, cross-border drivers of conflict and cross-border consequences of conflict, right? So even if these aren't strategic, it's still important to understand the extent to which something that happens in country A can affect conflict outcomes in country B, right? Because we can learn then about how policies outside of a target country can influence conflict outcomes within the target country. I won't refer to all of these papers on every slide, but this presentation, this class, is heavily influenced by the following sort of review papers. So a review paper it's forthcoming in the annual review on geoeconomics by Moore and Trebesh, my co-author. A couple of reviews on geoeconomics and trade, an excellent review on conflict and external policy from Dominic Rohner, and a shorter review on conflict and development by Rohner and Tunick. Okay, so the outline for the rest of the talk, we've already discussed sort of our definition of this intersection of geoeconomics and conflict. And the next section, which I think is the key conceptual section, we're going to carefully talk about our motivation and our theoretical background for geoeconomics and conflict. Okay, so our theoretical framework for understanding how external policies or external policymakers can influence conflict outcomes in third-party countries. We're then going to review the intersection of geoeconomics and conflict, as I just mentioned. We'll briefly discuss the potential pathways, so these sort of thinner research areas where there's plenty of scope for more work. We'll do one slide on methodological challenges, or specifically on how people are overcoming methodological challenges in this area. And then we'll have 2 slides of quick discussion at the end, and then we'll do a bit of Q&A. Okay. So I'm going to start with 2 observations that's going to give us our framework for a theoretical background. And these are 2 observations that you're probably very aware of already, but it's worth sort of clarifying, quantifying these 2 observations and focusing on the international dimension. The first observation is something you know already. War is extraordinarily costly. We are still very much learning about how costly war is. And it's costly in ways that I don't think we always understood. So this is a famous statistic from Fearon and Leighton. 360,000 people died directly due to conflict from 1944, so from the end of Second World War to 1999. Using the UCDP data that we just talked about, we can estimate that maybe 108,000 people per year on average died directly from conflict from 1989 to 2023. Of course, these direct fatalities, these sort of combat fatalities, don't give us the full picture of the costs of war, right? So there's also an equally sized casualty list in terms of indirect fatalities. So conflict leads to disrupted markets, it undermines the provision of public goods, it upsets disease environments, and depending on the paper, it's estimated that the death toll from these indirect mechanisms is roughly of an equal magnitude to the direct fatalities, right? So you can basically double that number in the first point. So that's costs in terms of fatalities, direct and indirect. War is also economically costly, right? So interstate wars, which is the focus along with internationalized conflict for this class, interstate wars cost around 10 to 15% of GDP and require 15 to 20 years to recover. So that's from an older paper by Organsky and Kugler in 1977. Interestingly, a very contemporary paper that uses more modern methods estimates something in the same ballpark, right? That interstate war decreases output by 20% and increases inflation by 10 percentage points, right? So conflict is costly in terms of direct fatalities, indirect fatalities, severe economic costs. International wars have been labeled by Robert Barrow as among the most disastrous macroeconomic shocks that exist. And on top of all this, I'm leaning a lot on work by Dominic Rohner and others here, there is potential for war traps theoretically. And this could explain why conflict tends to persist, right? So conflict is pretty rare across space, but once conflict starts, it's very, very difficult to end. One reason why it might be difficult to end is this idea of multiple equilibria. And we can see at least two sources of war traps. So one is due to low productivity. So we know that conflict leads to low productivity that undermines the provision of public goods. We also know that low productivity leads to conflict by decreasing the opportunity cost of participating in war. So because of this reinforcing mechanism, this is potentially a property that can lead to multiple equilibria, right? So you're stuck in a bad equilibrium of low productivity, high conflict. There's another sort of distinct mechanism that can lead to war traps, which is this idea of trust and trade, right? So if two potential trading partners trust one another, they trade a lot. Because they trade a lot, the opportunity cost of conflict is very high. Okay, so you can see how a good equilibrium could exist. But all it takes is a shock or a sufficiently sized shock that can move you to a bad equilibrium, which is low trust and low trade and high conflict. And because there's low trade between the potential belligerents, that means the opportunity cost of conflict is quite low, right? So war is extraordinarily costly in terms of direct fatalities, indirect fatalities, economic costs, and the potential for traps, right? The potential for persistence. So that's observation number one. And I appreciate that we probably all knew this already. Observation number two is that these costs are diffuse. So what I mean by this is these costs spill over across borders. There are very large cross-country spillover costs of war. They increase in the vicinity of the fighting, right? So that makes a lot of sense. Countries that are close to conflict themselves suffer more than countries that are farther away. So international wars have also been found to be associated with shortages in the US economy. So this is just an insight into how with an integrated global economy, a war that happens over there can affect prices and quantities over here. Wars also force substitution between local and imported goods or local and imported inputs. This can have very large adverse effects on firms, on supply chains, and on economic networks more broadly. So this is very, very contemporary research trying to quantify the extent to which wars can propagate through economic networks, right, through supply and demand. And then, as I mentioned at the top, there's also the shadow cost of war, right? So the extent to which even the risk of war can undermine investment and trade. So war is extraordinarily costly, and these costs are diffuse. They diffuse across borders through many, many mechanisms. So with those two observations, war is costly, these costs are diffuse. This should lead us to two sort of corollaries, right? So number one, I'm sure you've already covered in this course. Number two, maybe not. So number one is war shouldn't happen, right? In the purely Coasian world, wars are so costly, they're so inefficient, they shrink the pie so much that there ought to exist a Coasian transfer that avoids conflict. So that's observation number one, or corollary number one. Corollary number two, and this is our key focus in this presentation, external actors Okay, so other countries or multilateral organizations ought to have very, very strong incentives to foster peace. Okay, so country B, country C, and country D should have very, very strong incentives to reduce the likelihood of conflict in country A. Okay, so that's something that arises from these two observations. So let's talk about the first corollary. Why does war happen? You've covered this already, but it's worth sort of giving ourselves a refresher before we get into this. The scope for intervention here is a transfer that avoids conflict that leaves all parties better off. Okay. This exists because war is costly. In the most simple contest success functions, the bargaining range, right? So the range of transfers that can avoid conflict is determined by the ratio of the costs of conflict to the benefits of conflict. So let's put this very, very, very simply. The more costly it is to fight, the less likely conflict should be. These costs could be direct costs of conflict. They could be opportunity costs, right? Foregone production due to conflict. And then the second part of this is the more beneficial it is to fight, the more likely is conflict, right? So if the prize becomes more valuable, so let's say the price of mineral deposits or oil deposits is increased, that's going to make conflict more likely. Okay, so the bargaining range is determined by the ratio of costs to benefits. The higher are the costs relative to the benefits, the easier it should be to facilitate that transfer. Okay, so that's number one. Now, in a frictionless world, in a Coasian world, bargaining will avoid war. But we all know that in the real world, bargaining fails. And there are many reasons why bargaining can fail. There are three very prominent reasons that I think most people agree are playing an important part of this. So number one is this idea of asymmetric information, and particularly incentives to misrepresent. So if I think that I have an 80% chance of winning a war, and you understand that you have a 20% chance of winning the war, we should come to an arrangement whereby a transfer can avoid conflict. Now, you can imagine a world where I think I have an 80% chance of winning. You also think you have an 80% chance of winning. In that scenario, we're far less likely to find the transfer that avoids conflict. Okay. And what complicates this is there are cases in which we're both strongly incentivized to misrepresent our relative strength. Okay. So bargaining can fail due to these information problems. Number two is very, very well known, the sort of Bob Powell commitment problems, right? So if any one of us has an incentive to renege on our deal, or if any one of us believes that the other party will renege on the deal in future, then the transfer won't avoid conflict. We're still going to fight. Okay? So in other words, in the absence of third-party contract enforcement, our transfer won't ensure peace. Okay? So this is about increasing the costs of a unilateral deviation from the arrangement that avoids conflict. Okay. And then the third one is this sort of very well-known political agency problem, okay, or the pro-war bias of the key decision makers in an economy. So in other words, if the pivotal decision maker, whether it's an autocrat or a president or something, if the pivotal decision maker tends to internalize the benefits of conflict, but is relatively sheltered from the costs of conflict, then they are going to be more likely to fight. Okay, so that's in a purely rational world, those agency frictions alone can explain why conflict can happen. Okay, so there's our theoretical background. Why does war happen? The bargaining range is going to be influenced by the ratio of cost to benefits, and conditional in the bargaining range, bargaining can fail due to these three reasons. We can talk about others as well, but these are three sort of big ones. Okay, so what's the scope for external intervention? Okay, so what's the scope for a third party country to decrease the likelihood of conflict in another country? So to incentivize peace, a first order goal should be to increase the costs of conflict and or decrease the value of the spoils for potential belligerents. Okay, so if you're looking at this from the perspective of a multilateral institution that's interested in ensuring peace and reducing the likelihood of conflict, this is a first order goal. Okay. And then conditional on this, to avoid bargaining failure, we need to think about interventions that can address these problems. So one example of an intervention that can address the informational problem is mediation. Right? So if it's possible for a mediator to increase free flow of information between potential belligerents, or to address the incentives they have to misreport the relative strength, that's something that can decrease the likelihood of conflict. For the commitment problem, you can imagine security guarantees or peacekeeping. So in other words, if someone breaches the contract, if someone reneges on the deal, they'll be punished. They'll be punished either through force or they'll be punished through other sanctions. And then the third one, and this is the far more woolly solution, right? So to address political agency frictions, in theory, one can imagine that if you strengthen democratic accountability, that should reduce those agency frictions. But quite how you do that is a totally different question, right? That's a very difficult one to think about from the perspective of an external actor. Okay. And then something we should keep in the front of our mind is I've been assuming for the past couple of slides that external actors are incentivized to foster peace because war is costly and the costs are diffuse. But it's a very important question to ask ourselves. Are external actors actually always incentivized to foster peace? Right. So what are the cases or conditions in which certain external actors may want to do the opposite, right? They may want to foment conflict in order to, get rid of some adversary and install some friendlier group into political power. Okay, so that's our theoretical background, and that's what we'll sort of keep in our mind as we discuss the topics and go along. Okay, so reviewing the intersection. One of the classic topics at the intersection of geoeconomics and conflict, probably the classic topic, is on trade and conflict, and this very age-old question: does economic integration lead to peace? Right? Does trade reduce the likelihood of conflict? The famous, what's called liberal view, is that trade leads to peace because it increases economic interdependence. So, in other words, if I'm trading with you and we're benefiting from the gains of trade, that sharply increases the opportunity cost of conflict between us, right? Why would we fight? Because now we're going to lose all these gains from trade. And this goes back to de Montesquieu in 1748 and many others. One very interesting variation on this, which I mentioned earlier, is this idea of multiple equilibria and war traps due to trade and trust, right? So if you have high trade and high trust and low conflict, and that could be your good equilibrium, and a sufficiently negative shock can leave you into a bad equilibrium of low trade, low trust, high conflict, and this could be one explanation for the persistence of conflict. There isn't a ton of micro level work on this question, but there are some examples of really nice papers that get at the underlying mechanism. So one very well-known paper by Soumitra Jha, who's the theme leader on another theme, maybe you've already seen his class, is this paper on inter-ethnic complementarities between Hindus and Muslims in medieval ports in South Asia, how that leads to greater tolerance today, right? So in areas where Hindus and Muslims had greater complementarities, okay, due to trade routes, they're less likely to be in conflict, and even more likely to exhibit tolerance today, many hundreds of years later. Now, the contrasting view on this is this sometimes labeled the realist view, which is this idea that, in some situations or in some conditions, trade can increase rivalries between states. And some reasons for this are strategic vulnerabilities, right? So it could be the case that, if one country becomes overly reliant on another, that can be that can increase rivalries between them. Another is competition for the gains from trade themselves. Another is competition for critical resources, right, which we could see some examples of today. One very interesting contribution by Martin Meyer and Tonig in 2008 is it's almost like a synthesis of a lot of these ideas. And the basic idea behind this is that bilateral trade decreases the probability of war between the two belligerents because you increase the opportunity cost of conflict. But almost paradoxically, global integration or globalization increases the probability of war because it becomes easier for each party to find another trading partner, right? To change their economic network. So if I'm relying on you for certain goods, or for trading certain goods, or for sourcing inputs, I can switch to another supplier, right? And the extent to which that becomes easier due to global integration, the more likely it is that you and I will find. Okay. The second sort of main topic at the intersection of geoeconomics and conflict is, as I mentioned, this geoeconomic toolkit. And the classic understanding of the geoeconomic toolkit is the use of one's economic capacity in pursuit of geopolitical aims. So we can think of this as being a fairly narrow, a fairly narrow set of tools. As for the objectives, we can allow for both types of objectives here, right? So it could be the case that a country has very narrow political goals, so maybe they want to undermine an adversary in a target state, or it could be more in line with the motivation for this class, maybe a more enlightened objective, that the third party or the external country or multilateral institution wants to reduce the risk of civil or interstate conflict. Okay, so we'll keep both of those in mind. So one important group of geoeconomic tools is what we broadly call economic aid. There are many, 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 many papers showing that geopolitical considerations significantly influence the allocation of aid, right? So if you imagine a world where aid is purely determined by need or by some combination of need and institutions, the actual allocation of aid across countries looks very different to that. Okay, and there are many, many ways to test this and to prove this. Within economic aid, we can think about specific classifications. So one is on hearts and minds. Um, so this is the idea that aid can affect attitudes towards the donor country. So one very striking example of this is by Andrabi and Das in northern Pakistan. Following the earthquake there, humanitarian aid from the US and the EU positively affected attitudes towards those donor countries, right? So the sort of argument here that if attitudes towards the US and Europe can be softened in northern Pakistan, then aid can affect attitudes almost anywhere, right? Um, some very, very well-known papers on economic aid in the context of war. So economic aid seems to undermine insurgencies, at least in these examples in Vietnam, which is the Dell and Carabin paper in 2017, and in Iraq. So it's a series of paper by Ellie Berman and co-authors. And the basic idea that's made more explicit in the 2011 JPE Berman et al. Paper is that in the context of an insurgency, success is critically determined by the support of civilians, right? So if civilians are supporting the insurgents, then that allows insurgents to benefit from information, allows insurgents to benefit from all the ways in which civilians can provide refuge, can provide information, can make it easier for the insurgency to be successful. You compare that or contrast that with the case in which civilians are on the side of the counterinsurgents. So there to be about the flow of information, and that flow of information will be hugely important in defeating the insurgency. So in a world where the support of civilians becomes a critical determinant of insurgency versus counterinsurgency, you can see how a more enlightened role for economic aid, hearts and minds, providing basic public goods and services, can be very important in that context. Okay, and one very specific and interesting comparison in the Dell and Carabin paper, and I'll let you guys read it if you haven't already, is this very neat regression discontinuity where they compare the activities of the U.S. Marine Corps to the U.S. Army, who had a very different philosophy about what the right actions are to defeat the insurgency. For the Marine Corps, it was this more enlightened hearts and minds, economic development as well as security. For the US Army, it was kind of a more blunt search and destroy raids um, uh, sort of an objective. And in the regression discontinuity, they can show very, very clearly that the US Marine Corps, a bundle of policies was far more successful in softening attitudes and also in undermining the insurgency. So a second and sprawling subset of papers in this broad area is on foreign aid and conflict. And it's good to start with sort of aggregate data. So in the aggregate, it looks like foreign aid reduces conflict depending on the magnitudes will vary depending on the paper. In theory, we can definitely see, so going back to our conversation on theory, we can definitely see how the effect depends on whether aid increases the opportunity cost of conflict. So imagine aid that increases access to education, improves health, labor market interventions, increases the opportunity cost of conflict. Now you can contrast that with aid where you're just sort of helicoptering in some valuable resource that can easily be looted, right? So in the former case, aid's going to increase the opportunity cost of conflict, it's going to decrease violence. And in the latter case, aid could do the opposite, right? It could increase the spoils of battle or increase incentives to control these resources. So that theoretical distinction does come through in the empirical research, which is pretty interesting. So I'm going to just give you two very quick examples. So one example of aid increasing the opportunity cost of violence is this really interesting conditional cash transfer program in the Philippines, studied by Ben Frost and co-authors. And the CCT has some of the normal, conditions that you would expect regarding education and health. But there's one very interesting specific condition about not having contact with armed groups in the community, right? So an extremely well-defined tight link to partaking in any sort of violent activity with an armed group. And perhaps unsurprisingly, that conditional cash transfer program ends up decreasing conflict. And then flipping it then, an example of foreign aid that seems to increase conflict, or at least increase the duration of existing conflict, is this very well-known paper by Nathan Nunn and Nancy Chan in 2014, showing how US food aid increases the duration of civil conflict, right? So that's an example of a lootable resource as opposed to addressing the opportunity cost of conflict. Okay, so this makes the question of foreign aid and conflict very interesting, because theoretically you can see it going opposite ways, right? It can exacerbate conflict or it can reduce conflict, and it all comes down to the design. And just to sort of hammer home that point, I have a paper with Nathan, a working paper on what we call development mismatch. And again, it's emphasizing this idea that context is critical. So we look at the impact of World Bank agricultural projects in Africa, and we show that these projects decrease conflict in areas that are traditionally agricultural, right? Because these are projects that increase the opportunity cost of violence. But we see that they increase conflict when they're assigned to traditionally pastoral areas, to areas where people are not crop agriculturalists in the first place. And why did this happen? Conflict over land, right? The project makes land more valuable to outside agriculturalists, and that increases conflict over the use of the land. And interestingly, that effect we find is muted when pastoralists have more political power. Okay, so this is the idea that political power sharing can reduce conflict by influencing the distribution of resources between groups. Okay, another part of the geoeconomic toolkit, again, we're still focusing on the carrot rather than the stick, is trade agreements, right? So this is a particularly promising but very thin literature. So you can imagine the potential for a huge peace dividend from regional trade agreements. The theory is very straightforward. So think of a regional trade agreement, and you can see how partaking in a regional trade agreement could signal a commitment to shift from the bad equilibrium that we spoke about a few slides ago. So that's the equilibrium of low trust and low trade, which has lots of conflict, to a good equilibrium, high trust and high trade, or low conflict. And it's possible that signing up to a regional trade agreement could be how one specific government commits to a partnership when there's some non-trivial probability that the government will change in future, right? To a more adversarial or belligerent party. And there's not a huge amount of evidence on this, or maybe there is, and we're missing it. But a lot of it is sort of consistent with what we think. So geopolitical incentives tend to influence both the signing and content of trade agreements. There is a complementarity empirically between economic motives and these political motives for joining regional trade agreements, right? So it turns out that countries that have a particularly bloody history with one another are more likely to enter regional trade agreements, right? So that's consistent with this theory, but perhaps not massively intuitive in the absence of this theory. And then one other sort of interesting note, this paper by Vicard in 2012, showing that deep trade agreements, so trade agreements with single markets and so on, they are associated with the lower probability of conflict versus shallow agreements, right? So the depth of integration is something that matters when it comes to conflict, at least in a correlational sense. Okay. The second part of the classic geoeconomic toolkit is broadly speaking economic sanctions. Okay, so just think the stick rather than the carrot, right? So these are restrictive policy measures to influence the target country. You could imagine trade sanctions, financial sanctions, military sanctions, and what some people call smart sanctions or person specific, right? So sanctioning an individual's ability to travel, freezing their assets, and so on. The theory is straightforward, right? So in theory, sanctions should increase the costs or reduce the spoils of conflict for potential belligerents. So sanctions are a tool that an outside actor can use. So sanctions themselves, there is a very large literature on sanctions. They tend to impose significant costs on civilians, and their effectiveness is still sort of up for debate. So they may indeed shorten civil wars, but they do so at the cost of a severe burden on civilians. One paper in particular, a micro level paper, looks at how sanctions have contributed to child stunting in Burundi by increasing food prices. Right, so you can think of many mechanisms through which sanctions can end up harming regular people and poor people. One particularly, I think, exciting direction for this literature is using very granular data on firms and individuals to study these smart sanctions. So here's one paper by Nigmatalina in 2023, and she shows that sanctioned Russian firms, so following the Ukrainian invasion, Russian firms who were sanctioned were better off than firms that were not sanctioned. And her explanation for this is that it's due to state protection, right? So the state piled in subsidies to support these Russian firms so that they don't suffer from being sanctioned. But of course, this results in a misallocation. And Nigmatalina estimates that this reallocation reduces Russian total factor productivity by 1%, right? So here's another example of the sanction causing widespread costs on citizens in general. Um, so another part of the toolkit is embargoes and blockades, so sort of more dramatic versions of sanctions, a complete halt of economic exchange with the target. There's very large and interesting research on this. Not all of it directly related to this course, because this course, of course, is focusing on fragile countries or very low-income countries. Um, one, one, one flavor of embargo that is very interesting, where there isn't a ton of work, is on arms embargoes. Okay, so it does look like arms embargoes could be a potentially less costly alternative to general sanctions, but enforcement is very difficult. And perhaps because enforcement is difficult, multilateral arms embargoes tend to be more successful than unilateral ones, right? So it makes sense when you think about coordinating the embargo across many countries. One data challenge in this literature is observing the flow of banned items. And one ingenious solution from Della Vigna and Ferrara is to look at stock valuations of weapon producers. So basically what they do here is they look at a trigger event and they look at the stock valuations of weapons producers. Okay, so the trigger event is in an embargo country, and they show that the stock valuation of weapons producers increases if the producers are headquartered in corrupt countries, but it doesn't increase if the producers are headquartered in less corrupt countries, right? So embargoes, seem to be binding for some weapons producers and not for others weapons producers. But I think from a research perspective, what's very cool about that paper is using stock valuations uh, um, to get a sense of what's happening to the movement of weapons across space. There are other tools in the broadly speaking sticks sanctions category. So strategic tariffs and other controls. Very interesting literature on political economy of strategic tariffs, export controls, investment screening. But maybe not first order for fragile countries. Um, Okay, a final part of the classic toolkit, and then I'll pause for a few seconds to look at the Q&A, is on transparency and traceability initiatives. Okay, so this is a very specific type of initiative that pertains to mineral production in conflict environments. So again, the theory here is very straightforward. A transparency or traceability initiative, the scope is here to reduce conflict by lowering the value of appropriable resources, right? So if there's conflict due to a boom in the value of mines or other type of resources like oil and gas, if you can lower the demand for that output by using a transparency and traceability initiative, well, that should reduce the value of the spoils of conflict, going back to our theory, right? So this is very applicable to capital intensive sectors. So we know that control over capital intensive sectors such as minerals and oil is an important driver of civil conflict. And the idea here is that imposing transparency can reduce demand for these for output produced by illicit armed actors. Okay, so two very well-known examples of this is the Kimberley process. Okay, so this is addressing blood diamonds or diamonds that come uh, from conflict settings. The Kimberley process in these, I think, working papers has been found to reduce conflict in areas around mines. And then we have evidence on the extractive industries transparency initiative, which I think is an opt-in transparency initiative. So it is interesting to think about who opts in, who doesn't, and maybe what external actors can do to increase the pressure on countries to sign up to these types of initiatives. But anyway, this was found by Berman et al. In 2017 that this initiative seems to matter, right? So what they find in this paper is that when mineral prices increase, they see more civil conflict events around mines in Africa. But for countries who have signed up to the EITI, that effect is muted. It's much smaller. So it looks like these initiatives can matter, right? So they reduce the effect of prices on conflict in mines in Africa. And what's interesting in that paper is they also look at the effect of very, very similar initiatives, the ICMM, ICGLR, and they find broadly similar pattern. Okay, so I'm going to move on to potential pathways. At this point, I think I'm just going to continue. I know I said I'd stop halfway to look at Q&A, but I might take another 5, 6, 7 minutes to finish the potential pathways, and then I'll just do all of the Q&A at once. Okay, so what we're calling potential pathways, these are avenues for more research where the existing literature is fairly thin, and where there's scope for a lot more work. Okay, so number one is I've told you about the classic geoeconomic toolkit, the sanctions and incentives, the carrots and sticks that states use to influence outcomes in other states, and where we think there's scope for plenty of work is on considering the full stack of geoeconomic investments or tools available to leaders, right? And the idea here is that we can't really understand the use of one tool without understanding what the whole choice set looks like. So in practice, what do states do to influence outcomes in other states? It's not just economic sanctions and incentives, it's other things as well, right? So going back to our motivation, our section 2 on motivation and theory, mediation, right? So mediation is something an external country can do to influence outcomes in another country. So again, the theory here is addressing asymmetric information by removing barriers to the flow of information. Some interesting questions for us are, who mediates? What are the incentives to mediate? Um, the way we've set up this class today, I'm, really emphasizing negative externalities from conflict as one reason why a country might mediate. But you could counter that and say, well, surely there's a huge collective action problem, right? So who's going to do it? Um, does domestic politics matter? So are politicians rewarding for mediating other conflicts? Is international prestige a part of it? Okay, so think of some efforts to mediating in Qatar and United Arab Emirates recently. There is some evidence that mediation is associated with conflict ending, with the reduced duration of war, but there's plenty of scope for more causal evidence on this. Similarly, security guarantees and peacekeeping. So again, the theory is that you can address the peacekeeping, you can address the commitment problem by enforcing the contract, by enforcing the transfer that avoids war, by punishing the first attacker. Here, there is promising evidence that UN peacekeeping missions are effective. But the type of peacekeeping mission matters. It matters that you have more troops, and it matters that you have more high quality troops from well prepared armies. But again, lots of scope for more work. So thinking about more nefarious interventions, or certainly more aggressive interventions than those two, there is an interesting literature on how external countries support foreign armed conflict actors, right? So it could be supporting the government itself, right? So that's military aid, supporting a counterinsurgency. So think of the US supporting, European allies in World War II. Think of, most of the Western world supporting Ukraine in recent years. Um, Very interesting papers looking at backlash to US military aid. So US military aid is associated with an increase in anti-US terrorism, right? Because it's sort of propping up these states that aren't very popular. And it's also associated with paramilitary attacks in Colombia. As we've discussed already, counterinsurgency efforts, it really depends on what the counterinsurgency efforts look like, right? So the hearts and minds economic development that's sort of tagged on to security seems to be more effective than blunt force approaches. We think there's plenty of scope for work on sponsoring insurgency and terrorism. So to what extent do external states sponsor insurgency and terrorist activities in other states? Okay, so there's some evidence that the existence of an ethnic diaspora could matter for this. There are plenty of papers sort of broadly speaking about the role of interstate rivalry and terrorism, but again, empirically very thin literature. There are more and more papers looking at the spread of jihadist violence in Africa, which has gone from being, almost 0% of conflict 25 years ago to almost 50% of conflict in Africa today. And there's plenty of scope, we think, for work on the presence and absence of non-African states in Africa in recent years, so the withdrawal of French troops and the influx of various Russian forces. Another part of the economic or the geoeconomic toolkit that we think is under research is sort of aggressive but unarmed intervention. So it could be covert operations, some interesting papers here on CIA activities, on coups, online foreign influence efforts. So the extent to which countries can influence behavior through, bots on Twitter or other kind of foreign influence efforts. What I'm referring to here, this Martin et al. 2022, this is a project by ESOC, so the Empirical Studies of Conflict Group. You should look this up. It's a data set collecting information on foreign influence efforts. So potentially very useful and interesting source for people to play around with. Economic sabotage, industrial espionage, military and infrastructure sabotage. So, we know that these things exist. We see it in the news. There are some high profile papers, but certainly, very thin literature, plenty of scope for more work. And cyber attacks and hacking, right? So if we can understand the impact of these things, it can help us to understand the strategic motive behind them, right? Who uses these tools? What is the impact in target countries? And how does that help us to understand strategic decision makers by the sender countries, by the source countries? Okay. So just as a way of wrapping all of that up, if we think of the classic geoeconomic toolkit as being the economic incentives and economic sanctions over here on the left, what we're saying is if we increase our understanding of the full scope of tools that leaders use in the real world, that's going to help us understand, which tools are substitutes, which tools are complements, what are the constraints different leaders face. So is it the case that an unconstrained leader is more easily able to sponsor, assassinations, insurgency, and terrorism? And maybe you can think of leaders in more democratic countries are sort of have their hands tied, right? They can use the classic economic incentives and sanctions, but they're less likely to use these more interventionist tools. So we think there's plenty of scope to think about a comprehensive characterization of the fully sort of integrated geoeconomic toolkit. Who uses which tool? When do they use it? What is the effect? What can we learn about the effect? Or what can we learn from the effect about strategic incentives? And then the final thing I'm going to talk about, I've gone 2 minutes over time, but hopefully I'll finish in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Um, there's plenty of scope for just very, very broadly speaking, more research on cross-border causes and consequences of conflict. So whether this is strategic or not, it can still help us to understand how external states and multilateral institutions can use policy to influence the likelihood of conflict in target countries. Okay, so on the cross-border origins of conflict, um, you can think of political bias and unchecked power in autocratic neighborhoods, right? So we know that with more pro-war bias, conflict is more likely. That's more likely to happen in an autocratic country. We know that conflict tends to spread across borders. Okay, there's a decay; it goes across borders by proximity. And so, one interesting question then is, is conflict more likely to spread from autocratic neighborhoods than democratic neighborhoods? There are many, many papers on terms of trade shocks and conflict. Okay, so the sector matters. If it's a labor-intensive sector, and then a positive price shock is going to decrease conflict. If it's a capital-intensive sector, it's going to go the opposite way. All of this research tells us that any policy that can influence terms of trade in a target country can also potentially affect the probability of conflict in that country, right? Climate shocks. So Nathan and I have a paper just out in Restud showing how droughts in certain parts of Africa, pastoral areas, can influence the likelihood of conflict in neighboring agricultural areas, right? And that's something that can go across borders as well. Now, ethnic diaspora. So this is a paper on ethnic partition by Michaelopoulos and Papagiannou, showing that ethnic uh, homelands or regions in Africa that were split by modern borders are more likely to experience conflict. One potential explanation for this is just the idea of secession and ethnic diasporas. And this gives sort of subnational evidence on something that much has been written on at the cross-country level. And then we think there's plenty of scope for work on weapons, and particularly on flows of weapons into countries and how that affects the likelihood of conflict in the country. And then finally, on the cross-border consequences of conflict. So, first order consequences of conflict across borders are flows of people, right? Refugees and migration, quantifying the effect of conflict on refugee flows. Where do refugees go? What are policies that one can think about in target countries that can improve assimilation of refugees and make it a net benefit for society? There's plenty of scope for work on this. Plenty of scope as well for economic cross-border consequences of conflict. So the extent to which conflict can influence food and energy prices, supply chain disruptions across many sectors in other countries. And then the other side of weapons, okay, the outflow of weapons. So, for example, what I'm thinking about here is, the end of the civil war in Libya. A lot of people think this could have been one of the reasons why weapons flowed across the Sahara into the Sahel, and could have been one reason why a conflict tended to exacerbate significantly across the Sahel after the end of the Second Civil War in Libya. Okay, in the last minute, a lot of what we're talking about in this class is state behavior, right? Thinking about how decisions by one state can affect outcomes in another. And we might think that this poses a big challenge in terms of data, right? We generally are a little bit wary of studying cross-country variation because cross-country characteristics can be correlated with many other things. They're not very amenable to sort of contemporary causal inference methods. Many of the papers that I talked about today get around this, and they get around it by using microdata to study these big picture questions, right? So using microdata to study the impact of these smart sanctions, using microdata to study these interethnic complementarities by some interest paper, using microdata to study the effect of terms of trade shocks and civil conflict. That's within Colombia, the Dubé and Vargas paper. Microdata to using legislator level decisions to understand state behavior. And microdata to study the impact of expected coups and firm level stock prices, right? So it is possible to get granular data, to use contemporary causal inference methods to answer some of these big picture questions. And I think that's what makes this feel very, very exciting, right? The scope to combine, uh, the rigor of micro level data and causal inference tools with these sort of big picture questions that we normally associate with cross country variation is a real opportunity. And then finally, just to set up a discussion or even to formalize or organize thoughts for you as we part in 8 minutes' time. So what do we do here? We discuss the intersection between geoeconomics and conflict, focusing on interstate and internationalized civil conflict. The big question, or at least the big question as we set it up, is that since conflict is very costly, and since these costs spill across borders, external states should have very strong incentives to intervene. It is an open question about whether they do or not. If they don't, why not? Is there a collective action problem? If so, what are the tools available to external actors to influence conflict outcomes in other countries, right? We've discussed the costs of war, trade and conflict, geoeconomic tools, and we think there's lots of scope for more work in thinking about the more expanded geoeconomic toolkit that leaders actually use in practice and to deepen our understanding of cross-border origins and consequences of conflict. Plenty of scope for advances with microdata, as I mentioned, using causal inference tools. And then finally, I'm going to allow myself a little bit of a more normative perspective for the final bullet of the class, is that it seems like there are large social returns to understanding how and why, or indeed whether, external actors deploy policies to influence the likelihood of conflict in other countries, right? To increase the opportunity cost of conflict participation, to decrease the value of conflict victory, or to overcome sources of bargaining failures. So we think this is a very, very promising area for research. Okay, so let me do a few minutes of Q&A, and then I'd like to finish with one wrap-up slide after that. So I think, as expected, I went way over time. So let me go to our Q&A. Okay, we have 9 things here. The supply of arms and fueling wars. What is your thought on this, please? Yeah, very good question. So I don't think there's a ton of literature looking at the impact of access to arms on the likelihood of conflict. So it's a very first order question, right? We would imagine that conflict is less likely if potential belligerents don't have access to arms. There aren't a ton of papers on weapons flows in general. So we think that that could be a pretty interesting area for future research. Have the cost of wars in Uganda and surrounding countries been documented? How do I access the literature? That's a great question. I don't have anything specific about costs of wars in Uganda. You could look at Chris Blattman's webpage. He's done a lot of work in Uganda. But let me think about that more, and I can get back to you if I can think of specific papers. How do we involve the people in the bargaining process to avoid conflict and its cost? That's a great question. Thinking about the specifics of interventions that can reduce the likelihood of bargaining failures is, I think, potentially a very, very, very fruitful area of research. There is a lot of theoretical research on this that goes back like 100 years, but empirically, this is challenging. You could perhaps imagine some lab games. Maybe there is a sprawling micro literature on this using lab games that I'm just unaware of. But I agree that that's a first order question. Okay, from Haile Badassa, we have the more costly it is to fight, the less likely is conflict. Does this hold for both developed and developing countries? Is cost and benefit from state point of view, party point of view? So just the basic idea that, in the frictionless world, conflict should be avoided, right? Because the size of the pie is going to shrink, so there should exist some transfer that avoids conflict. Okay, the size of the bargaining range is going to be influenced by how costly conflict is, right? So if conflict is very costly because you have to reallocate resources away from something that's super productive, then it should be easy to avoid conflict. But if conflict is not that costly because there isn't much else going on in an economy, there's been a drought, or export prices are low, something like that, then it's going to be harder to find the transfer that avoids conflict. You'd imagine that it holds for both developed and developing countries, right? So conflict is going to be very costly in a developed country because you are going to be more likely to have third-party contract enforcement, right? Just because of stronger institutions. Um, you're more likely to, the state is more likely to have a monopoly on violence in more developed countries. And you could think of that as being the commitment problem is solved, right? Because there's such a credible threat of third-party contract enforcement through courts, through the judicial system, and indeed through force. The conflict is likely very costly in more developed countries. But I think that the theory applies to uniformly, right? And then the final question: what are variables that measure the opportunity cost? Could you give some examples? That's a really good question. A lot of the papers that I've cited look at this. So one way to think about varying opportunity costs of conflict is commodity prices, right? So the paper that I mentioned by Dubé and Vargas, they look at how international coffee and oil prices can influence the location of conflict in Colombia. The idea is that when coffee prices are really high, the returns to farming coffee are really high, and that's a labor-intensive sector. So they show that when coffee prices increase, conflict falls because the opportunity cost of conflict for would-be fighters is increased. And then they sort of flip the picture when it comes to oil. So when oil prices increase, oil is not a labor-intensive sector, it's a capital-intensive sector. So when oil prices increase, that increases the value of the spoils of conflict. It increases the value of the prize, and that has the opposite effect. That increases conflict, right? So higher coffee prices reduces conflict, and higher oil prices increases conflict. And that's because of the opportunity costs increasing in the case of coffee, and the value of the spoils of battle increasing for the case of oil. And then I mentioned a cash transfer paper by Ben Crost. So Ben Crost from the University of Calgary in Canada. You can look him up. Lots of interesting papers. That's a specific paper on a conditional cash transfer in Philippines that decreased conflict. Does geopolitical consideration also influence agency ratings? That's a good question. I have no good answer for that. I don't know anything about what influences agency ratings. Um, um, Okay, the free movement of persons in West Africa has allowed Fulani bandits to conflict in the region. Yeah, so I can point you toward a couple of papers on nomadic populations and conflict in Africa. So one is my paper with Nathan Nunn, so that's McGuirk and Nunn 2025 in Restud. And there we look at how droughts in pastoral areas are contributing to conflict between farmers and herders in neighboring agricultural areas. Another paper then, again by McGuirk and Nunn, you can see it on my website, is on how agricultural development projects is also affecting conflict between farmers and herders, this time in agricultural parts of Africa. And then another paper by Eberle, Eberle, and Dominic Roner and Matthias Tonig, I think, forthcoming in Restat, also looking at how weather shocks influences conflict between nomadic and non-nomadic populations. So a very thin literature, but very much an active literature. Any specific evidence about transparency initiatives have reduced conflicts in Africa? Yes. Berman et al. 2017 American Economic Review. And the idea here is that what they find on average is higher mineral prices increase conflict around mines. But for areas and countries that have signed up to the EITI, that effect is lower. So it looks like that transparency initiative muted the effect of prices and conflict. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm going to get through every other one. I've got two more I can do quickly. Several countries cannot incur losses of direct warfare, but engage in cross-border terrorism, training and espionage. How can international funding institutions deter themselves from loaning such countries? That's a great question. That's exactly the type of question where we think there's plenty of scope for more work. So to what extent are states involved in cross-border terrorism, training, espionage, and so on? And how can we say the international community or an external state influence this? All right, how can they constrain this? And then the final question: what kind of variations in microdata are usually exploited while studying these research questions? So I would encourage you to take a look at some of the papers that I cited in this. So as I mentioned, some of the variation could be in commodity prices. Some of the variation could be weather shocks that influence the returns to farming, right? So these are, plausibly exogenous sources of variation uh, in the opportunity cost of conflict. Thank you very much for these great questions. I'm 2 minutes over time, so I'm going to end with this. I want to say thank you to everyone for attending the course and for actively engaging throughout the course. So this is the very last class. The recordings of all the sessions are available on the recipe website. We are determined to build a community around this group, around this recipe initiative. We have plenty more activities to come, so please keep an eye out for this. Please do subscribe to our newsletter for updates and information about upcoming events and initiatives. And the last thing I want to do is say a warm thanks to Baucan, to Mandy, and to Emma for organizing and coordinating everything. Thank you very much.